In the frozen plains of Manchuria, a compound stood behind high walls and electric fences. No trials, no records. Thousands entered and never left. When the war ended, the men who ran this place didn't face the gallows like their German counterparts. Instead, they made a deal. The Americans wanted what they knew. The price was silence. What kind of experiments could be so valuable that mass murderers walked free, their crimes erased from history? In 1932, Japan's military expansion into Manchuria created more than territorial control. It created opportunity. Opportunity for research that no government would openly approve. Opportunity for experiments that required one thing above all else: human subjects who would never leave. The man who saw this opportunity was Shiro Ishii, a military doctor with ambitions that extended far beyond medicine. Brilliant, persuasive, and utterly convinced that biological weapons would decide future wars, Ishii had spent years trying to convince Japan's military leadership to invest in his vision. In Manchuria, far from Tokyo's scrutiny and international observers, he finally found his chance. The facility that emerged in 1936 near the city of Harbin carried an unremarkable name: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. To anyone asking questions, it existed to protect Japanese troops from disease. Water purification, public health, nothing that would draw attention or concern. But names can hide almost anything when no one is allowed to look closer. The compound that took shape behind high walls and guard towers had nothing to do with prevention. Its laboratories weren't designed to stop disease. They were designed to perfect it. Its holding cells weren't for quarantine. They were for something else entirely. And the people brought there in trucks that arrived after dark weren't patients. They were raw material for research that had no limits and no rules. The compound outside Harbin operated under a simple designation: Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. The name suggested hygiene, public health, protection from disease. Inside, the work had nothing to do with prevention. Prisoners arrived in cattle cars and military trucks: Chinese civilians, Soviet soldiers, Korean resistance fighters, Mongolian nomads. They came from prisons, from occupied villages, from interrogation centers across Manchuria. Most had no idea where they were being taken. Some had committed minor infractions. Others had simply been in the wrong place when the trucks came through. The staff called them maruda, logs. The term spread through the facility until it became standard vocabulary. Not prisoners, not subjects, logs. As if they were raw material being processed through a mill. The research began with infection. Plague bacteria cultivated in massive incubators, then introduced into healthy bodies through injection, through contaminated food, through aerosol spray in sealed rooms. Researchers recorded the progression: fever onset, lymph node swelling, respiratory failure, death. Then they moved to the next batch, adjusting variables: dosage, delivery method, strain virulence. Anthrax followed the same pattern: cholera, typhoid, glanders. Each disease studied not for treatment, but for weaponization. How much was needed to kill? How quickly did it spread? Could it survive in bombs? In water supplies? In food stores? The vivisection rooms operated on a different schedule. Subjects infected days earlier were strapped to tables while still conscious. No anesthesia. The researchers needed to see living organs, active disease processes, real-time biological responses. Scalpels opened abdomens, hands moved through chest cavities, lungs were removed while still breathing, hearts extracted while still beating. Detailed notes filled page after page. Measurements, observations, photographs. In the winter, other teams worked outside. Frostbite research required cold, and Manchuria provided it. Prisoners were taken into the yard before dawn, their arms exposed to sub-zero air for hours. Some were doused with water first. Researchers monitored tissue damage at intervals, striking frozen limbs with sticks to test brittleness. When the exposure period ended, subjects were brought inside for thawing experiments. Hot water, warm air, direct heat. The goal was to understand cold weather combat injuries. The method was to create them deliberately and watch what happened. The pressure chambers stood in a separate wing, massive steel cylinders designed to simulate high altitude. Subjects were sealed inside while technicians adjusted atmospheric pressure, replicating conditions at 20,000 feet, 30,000, higher. Researchers observed through portholes as lungs collapsed, as blood vessels burst, as bodies convulsed. They recorded the exact point of organ failure, the precise moment of death. Other experiments tested human limits in different ways. Starvation studies, dehydration trials, subjects suspended upside down to measure blood flow changes, prisoners injected with animal blood to explore transfusion possibilities, women impregnated through rape, then infected to study disease transmission to fetuses. The data accumulated in filing cabinets and laboratory journals, thousands of pages, tens of thousands of observations, all of it built on a foundation that treated human beings as expendable research material. Production facilities ran parallel to the research labs. Plague fleas bred by the millions in climate-controlled rooms. Bacteria cultured in ceramic bombs designed for aerial deployment. Chocolate laced with anthrax, prepared for covert distribution. The operation had moved beyond study. It was manufacturing biological weapons at industrial scale. And through it all, the trains kept arriving. New logs to replace the ones consumed. The work never stopped. The research never slowed. Because somewhere in Tokyo, in planning rooms and strategy sessions, men in uniforms were waiting for results, waiting for weapons, waiting for an edge that conventional warfare could not provide. The compound had become a machine, and it was running at full capacity. Most people stop at the surface of history, but you're still here. So if you want the parts they don't teach, the truths buried beneath time, consider subscribing and becoming part of those who chose to see it all. Now, let's continue. By the spring of 1945, the walls were closing in. Soviet forces pushed toward Manchuria from the north. American bombers darkened the skies over Japan. Inside the sprawling complex at Pingfong, the men of Unit 731 knew their time was running out. The orders came down in August: destroy everything, leave nothing behind. What followed was a systematic erasure, a frantic attempt to bury years of atrocity before the world could see. Buildings were rigged with explosives. Furnaces burned day and night, consuming documents, photographs, research notes. The breeding chambers where plague-infected fleas had multiplied by the millions were flooded with gasoline and set ablaze. Vats of bacterial cultures were smashed. Equipment was dismantled, loaded onto trucks, and driven into the countryside to be buried or dumped into rivers. But the most urgent task was eliminating the witnesses. The remaining prisoners, those still alive in the cells, were killed. Some were shot. Others were given lethal injections. A few were locked inside buildings before the explosives went off. The staff worked quickly, methodically. No one could be left to tell what had happened here. By the time Soviet troops arrived at Pingfong in mid-August, they found ruins, shattered concrete, charred wood, silence. Ishii and his senior officers scattered. Some fled south into China. Others made their way back to Japan, slipping into the chaos of a defeated nation. They changed their names, destroyed their uniforms, and disappeared into civilian life. For a brief moment, it seemed the secret might die with the empire. But American intelligence had been listening. Intercepted communications, interrogations of captured personnel, whispers from Chinese sources. By late 1945, investigators knew something had existed in Manchuria, something beyond conventional warfare. They knew about biological weapons, they knew about human experiments, and they knew the men responsible were still alive. The question was what to do with them. The evidence was fragmentary. The facilities were destroyed. But the data, The results of thousands of experiments, the knowledge gained from years of unthinkable research that still existed. It was scattered, hidden, but recoverable. And it was valuable. The kind of information that could not be obtained any other way. The kind that might take decades to replicate through ethical means. In Tokyo, American occupation officials faced a choice. They could pursue justice. Bring Ishii and his colleagues before a war crimes tribunal, expose what had happened at Pingfang, hold them accountable alongside the Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, or they could make a deal. Offer immunity in exchange for the data. Bury the crimes to gain the knowledge. The Cold War was already beginning. The Soviets were an emerging threat. Biological warfare was a frontier neither side fully understood. And the men from Unit 731 were offering something no one else could provide. Real-world results from experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, but had been conducted with scientific rigor. The decision came quietly, without public debate or official record. There would be no trial, no testimony, no justice for the thousands who had died in those cells. Instead, there would be an exchange. Silence for data. Freedom for secrets. The Americans arrived with a proposition. In the winter of 1946, as the world prepared for justice at Tokyo, a different negotiation unfolded in quiet rooms far from the courtroom. General Douglas MacArthur's intelligence officers sat across from the scientists of Unit 731, men whose hands were stained with the deaths of thousands. The offer was simple: immunity from prosecution, freedom, in exchange for one thing: everything they had learned. The data was what mattered now, not the screams in the frostbite chambers, not the bodies in the plague pits. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviet Union was developing biological weapons. America needed to catch up, and these men held years of research that no Western scientist could replicate. Research conducted without the constraints of ethics, consent, or humanity. Ishii Shiro understood the value of what he possessed. He had kept meticulous records, photographs, temperature charts, infection rates, autopsy reports, data on how the human body responds to anthrax, plague, cholera, frostbite, and pressure changes. Information gathered from thousands of living subjects. He knew no American laboratory could produce this knowledge, and he knew that made him untouchable. The deal was struck in silence. No formal agreement, no public announcement, just an understanding. The scientists would provide their findings. In return, their names would never appear at the War Crimes Tribunal. They would walk free. They would return to their lives. Some would even continue their careers in medicine and research. The files were handed over. Boxes of documents, slides of tissue samples, reports written in clinical language that stripped away the humanity of the victims and reduced them to data points. The Americans took everything. They classified it. They studied it. They built upon it. In December 1949, the Soviet Union held its own trial in Khabarovsk. 12 members of Unit 731 stood accused. They confessed. They described the experiments in detail. The court sentenced them to labor camps, but the West dismissed the trial as propaganda. The major figures, Ishii and his top scientists, were already protected, already free, already beyond reach. The trade was complete. Knowledge for immunity, science for silence. The architects of Pingfang would never face the same justice as their counterparts in Germany. The data was more valuable than accountability. The research was more important than the dead. The war ended. The laboratory burned, but the men who ran it simply walked away. Shiro Ishii returned to Tokyo in August 1945 and disappeared into the quiet suburbs. No trial, no prison. He opened a small clinic in Shinjuku, treating patients for common ailments: colds, infections, minor injuries. His neighbors knew him as a polite doctor with a calm demeanor. They had no idea what his hands had done. By the early 1950s, he was consulting for the Japanese National Institute of Health. He attended medical conferences. He published papers on infectious diseases. He lived in a comfortable home with his family, took walks in the park, and died of throat cancer in 1967 at the age of 67. He never faced a courtroom. Masaji Kitano, who succeeded Ishii as commander of Unit 731, became a respected figure in Japan's medical community. He joined the Green Cross Corporation, a pharmaceutical company, and rose to a senior position. The company produced blood products and vaccines. Kitano helped shape its research direction. He was never questioned about ping-pong. He died peacefully in 1986. Ryoichi Naito, another Unit 731 officer, founded his own pharmaceutical company after the war. It grew into a successful enterprise. He became wealthy. He was known as a businessman and a patron of medical research. His past remained unspoken. Across Japan, dozens of former Unit 731 personnel resumed their careers. Some became university professors. Others joined hospitals, research institutes, and government health agencies. A few wrote medical textbooks. Their wartime work was never mentioned in their official biographies. The Japanese government did not investigate them. The public did not know their names. The victims' families received nothing. No apology, no compensation, no acknowledgement that their loved ones had even existed. In China, survivors who had been exposed to biological attacks or escaped from the compound lived with scars, infections, and trauma. They had no documentation, no proof. The Japanese government denied that Unit 731 had conducted human experiments. Official records listed it as an epidemic prevention unit. When families asked questions, they were met with silence. The full scope of what happened remained locked away. The United States classified the data it had received. The reports on frostbite, plague dissemination, and vivisection were stamped secret and stored in military archives. Japan destroyed most of its own records. What survived was scattered, incomplete, or hidden. For decades, the story existed only in whispers. Among a few researchers, a handful of journalists, and the people who had been there. It wasn't until the 1980s that the silence began to crack. A Japanese journalist named Akira Yoshimura started investigating. He found former unit members willing to talk off the record. He pieced together fragments of testimony. In 1981, author Seiichi Morimura published The Devil's Gluttony, a book that exposed Unit 731 to the Japanese public for the first time. It became a bestseller. The revelations shocked the nation. Pressure mounted. Historians in China, Japan, and the United States began demanding answers. Survivors came forward. Documents were declassified. In 1997, a group of Chinese victims filed a lawsuit against the Japanese government, seeking recognition and compensation. The case dragged through the courts for years. In 2002, a Japanese judge acknowledged that Unit 731 had conducted human experiments and caused immense suffering. But the court ruled that the victims had no legal right to compensation. The government was not required to pay. Even now, the Japanese government has never issued a full official apology specifically for Unit 731. Textbooks mention it briefly, if at all. The site of the Pingfeng compound is a museum, but it took decades of advocacy to establish it. Ishii's grave is unmarked and unvisited. The men who worked under him are mostly forgotten. The trade was complete. Immunity for data, silence for freedom. And for half a century, it held. But history does not stay buried forever. Only long enough for those who made the deal to die in peace.